We'll now shift to our meeting with the Warrant Committee Elementary School Project Subcommittee, which was scheduled with wild optimism for 7 o'clock. It's now 7:45, and so rather than have all of you stay through the rest of our meeting, we're obviously more than welcome to do so, but we might as well move on to this part of our agenda. So
Oh, we can sit up front.
Not you, Bob. Anyone else can sit up. You can
Make sure your iPad, because that's not coming to the front row.
you can stay right where you are. No.
I just moved the first time, so it didn't look like we were doing boy-girl things.
Welcome to Warrant Committee Chair Sharon Tatro and Warrant Committee members. If you could just all introduce yourselves for the record and for people watching at home, and then we can. You do need a mic, yes, if you'd like to be heard.
Not that one. There we go.
Steve Callahan.
Welcome.
Jillian Rafter.
Welcome.
Sharon Tatro.
Hello.
You already acknowledged. Bob Sliney.
Welcome, Mr. Sliney. All right, welcome. So I think this meeting is being held at your request.
It is, and so I guess just to kick that off, we as a warrant committee and then us as a subcommittee have decided that the best way to try to tackle the future upcoming article for the special town meeting was to have some just conversations with who we have kind of listed as the stakeholders in this. And so you, of course, are on this list. The SBC, the school committee, and Dale at Dale, and the other elementary school PAC are also on our list. So you get the pleasure of being the first one, so we can have the dry run together. We wanted this to be pretty casual from the standpoint, we just wanted to maybe ask some questions that we all have, and we also wanted to find out from you, what are the questions that you are getting from townspeople that you think that we should be looking at most while we're kind of going through this process? Because our intention is to make sure as much as possible all the questions that are out there in the town have factual based answers for them to be able to make their own decision. So that's kind of our goal. So I don't know if any of you want to start or if we want to just hear from you guys as to what you're hearing. Does anyone have an opinion? It's our first one.
I think just getting your insight to start would be beneficial, just to see what we should focus on as we embark on this endeavor.
That's setting a high bar, expecting us to have insight on this. You're obviously new to this.
I am, yes.
We'll be happy to say some words at you, and you can decide whether we're...
If they're insightful. Okay, fair enough.
So, all right, if you want us to start, Pete.
So there was a huge flurry of input about this issue back when the issue was up for a vote before the select board and the school building committee. It has tapered off dramatically, at least to me. I don't get the volume of questions about it since then. The questions then were mainly around the finances, I think, and there were a lot of people that lived in the neighborhood of Wheelock that were concerned about traffic issues. I haven't heard anybody address the thing that was really important to me as I listened to the school building committee, which was that most of the members said that if we built this new school at the Dale Street site, that the site is too small and we would get a compromised building. That, for me, has remained the main concern for me. I don't want to spend tens of millions of dollars and end up with a school that is compromised. I think that the other things that have been the other positives of the Wheelock site, the educational synergies, there's been some debate about that, certainly. I don't know enough.
Can I back you up 1 second and just ask a follow-up question? When you mentioned that the Dale site is compromised inside, is your question as to whether or not you think that's true, or is your question as in you would like more information to know if that's true?
So here are my notes from the September 16, 2020 meeting. Mike Quinlan, Dale congested. Tim Bonfatti, Dale Site too tight. A new school does not fit. Runs into uncertainties. Dale Site too small to do it right. Mike Weber said Dale add reno could be great, but as someone in construction, it is not practical, site too tight. So that the people on the school building committee who seem to have experience in building schools thought that the Dale Street site was too small. And that, I don't know how you get around that sort of expertise giving you opinions. I always tell my clients that the best thing that they can hire me for is my gut reaction as an attorney who's practiced law for decades. And that's what I'm hearing from these people that are very experienced in this field. So for me, that was the decision point.
Gotcha. Next.
He's on the committee, so you're going to get more insight from him than either Pete and me combined. I do track a lot of the posts and the debates that have gone on, and for the most part, like 99.9% have stayed out of it. Mainly because I don't think I have superior knowledge to add. I have opinions, but I don't have superior knowledge. And if there is anyone on the committee that has superior knowledge on this specific issue, it will be him you'll hear from third. There's a couple of things that are driving my thinking about this. The first point about the debate between the two locations, I have heard from people on both sides of the issue who I have very high respect for. And so what happens is there's people here saying one thing, there's people here saying another thing. I think an awful lot of them all, and it's like there are strong arguments relative to what people value. So that's the first point is I don't think there's any clear wind blowing in one direction or the other here. And that's a worry for me come fall, because what I don't know for sure is even though people have different opinions, how many of those people will literally fall on their sword over a decision that doesn't, if it comes down to the decision they didn't want, do they not want it so much that they'll fall on their sword? Many people say they'll do that, particularly I think on the Dale side. I'm not sure how true that gets to be when push comes to shove. So that's the first point. I know what I've got. It's both sides of the seesaw. I can't discern truth there. Second point, from my perspective in this debate, or probably since at least the beginning of the year, there has been confusion on the part of people who make these clear statements that one option is a whole lot cheaper than the other option. I kind of locked in when the building committee first laid out those options, and what I came away with was, for all intents and purposes, when you're at a $75 or $80 million project, plus or minus $1 or $2 million, those options are equivalent. Now, those are direct costs. There's then been the secondary discussion around the secondary costs, around either the infrastructure that we have to put in here, or what are we going to do with the old Dale School if we don't get there. I think there's some validity to raising those issues, but I don't think it's valid to simply start piling on those second-tier costs to one option that you don't like. And so there's, like in the case of the Dale Street School, it may cost us money in town, but I don't have any doubt that the town will very quickly come up with some good ideas for how to reuse that school if we don't use it for a school. So I do think, especially if I were on the Warrant Committee, I would be concerned with tracking what I think of as second-order costs, because they kind of are a big deal, but they aren't necessarily, in my mind at least, a strict driver in terms of the direct decision. They're the implications. The last piece of this for me is that, and this is a broader lesson I think I've learned as a selectman, if you appoint a committee to do a job, if you think the committee is following an improper process in doing that job, then I think it's appropriate for you as a selectman to second guess the actions of that committee and do what you think is necessary to get the committee on the right track. So about a year ago, when we delayed approving the submission at that time so that there were time for more public meetings, from my standpoint, that was a process issue that wasn't being carried out right. On the other hand, when a committee has been appointed to do a job, even if I had an opinion that was different than what the committee recommended, and I'm not saying that that's the case here, I would be very reluctant to simply say, oh, I appointed a committee, but I had a hip pocket answer, and I was hoping the committee would get to my hip pocket answer, but seeing as they didn't, I'm going to step in and override it. So my specific position around where we are right now in this process is that I am supportive of what the committee elects to come to the Board of Selectmen for approval with, because I have confidence that we put in competent people and that they've gone through a process. And I recognize the critiques of what hasn't happened, especially around education. I think there's a whole lot more could have been done there. Last point, and this is my point. A year and a half ago, in a joint school committee, Board of Selectmen meeting, and I think the Warrant Committee was there too, I basically arbitrarily stuck a stake in the ground around affordability. That stake said whatever financing this town has to take out to support this town should not result in total debt of the town that exceeds the value of the town budget. In really round numbers, our town budget's around $70 million. By the time we're planning to float this debt, we'll have about 20 million in remaining principal on existing debt. Do the math, we have $50 million. If the MSBA reimburses 23% of that, we have about $60 to $62 million is where the price of this school needs to be. That's my position. I understand that there may be pushback, and some of that pushback may be legitimate, but if there's not a voice for affordability on behalf of the taxpayers of the town, it's probably more you guys than me, in fairness, but that's where my stake is, and I, at this point, have not moved it.
Okay, so on the first question you asked about sort of what questions we get asked and the concern, I mean, I think my experience is similar to Pete. There was a lot of communications, around the time when the school building committee, and we were making a judgment about site selection. And I think they fell kind of into two major buckets, other than questions like, how could you be so stupid to even consider putting something in Elm Street, which was a substantial percentage of the communications that I got. Putting aside those kind of questions, I think probably the majority were people who lived in the general area who were concerned about traffic and impact in the neighborhood and loss of some of the open space over there. I would say if I looked at the addresses of the people I got emails from, that would probably be the plurality of those. And I would say the next group are people who largely had kids go through the schools, who liked the location somewhat closer to downtown, kind of liked Dale Street, didn't think there's anything wrong with what we're doing now, why change it? There's definitely a divide in correspondence. I think that most of the people who have younger kids yet to go through the school, who I hear from, favor the Elm Street location. I think a lot of the people who favor the Dale Street location don't have more kids to go through the school. It's not uniformly true. There's variation. But I would say, at least anecdotally, since you asked about the kind of communications I would get, I would say there's a clear divide there, and on that front. And again, that's no more scientific than anything else. But I would say that's definitely noticeable that a lot of the pro Elm Street folks I hear from say, I've got kids who are 1, 3, and 5, and see the benefits of looking ahead and having one drop off for kids who are in 2nd grade and 4th grade and all of that. So, and then the third one is cost. I think similar to Gus, I think there's been some misconceptions about cost in the process and the variability between them. I think the more time I spend in the school building committee going through this, so many of the costs are fixed in the sense that if you want to build a school that meets the MSBA requirements and meets the academic program and meets the enrollment that's agreed, there's sort of, you can't get below a certain amount, right? Because the MSBA has requirements for how big the classrooms has to be. They've got requirements for how big the cafeteria has to be, how big you have to have, you have to have certain things. You can't decide, we're not going to have a cafeteria and the kids will just eat in the room. So there are minimums that the MSBA sets for schools that if you meet them, it's hard to get below it, right? Hard to get it much lower. I think the analogy, the question I asked in a budget discussion the other night is sort of as you range the building between a tent and the Taj Mahal, where is this? And it's not quite a tent, but it's pretty far away from a Taj Mahal. In a lot of cases, with maybe about I think we're about 3,000 square feet of the building is not required by the MSBA standards. So wherever you build it, that's kind of, our gym's a little bigger, our stage is a little bigger. There was, there's a couple of other pieces of the building. Otherwise,
Am I right that the daycare's been taken out of it?
Daycare's been taken out.
Yeah, good.
Daycare's been taken out. So that was the discussion we had the other night. So that's kind of what I've been hearing. From my own perspective on it, I think in keeping with something that I talk about a fair amount is trying to think about this kind of in the long-term context of the town and what this means for the next thing and the next thing after that, because when you build a building, it lasts 75 years or 80 years or longer, and each decision we make has ramifications for the next one. And one of the things that's been important to me in thinking about the location issue and the school issue is if you build the school, if you were to stay where we are, it seems to me we are committing ourselves to having 3 elementary schools, because we have about, even at our low enrollment right now, we have about 1,200 kids in the elementary schools. I do not believe, even if, to Pete's point about the tightness of the site, which I think is true, even if you were to say it's worth sacrificing that extra space and that extra room to move and sacrificing the other things you'd be sacrificing, I don't think you're going to get all the elementary school kids in town on that one campus. So I think, maybe you get 2/3 of them as what you have now, but getting all of them on that one campus seems to me to be a stretch. So you're basically, I think, committing to keeping 3 elementary schools if you were to stay at Dale Street. This was important to me in kind of deciding this, that we would be committing the town when it came time for Wheelock to be replaced, that we'd have to replace it, and probably replace it in the same location. I think, Wheelock is the same age as all of our other school buildings, essentially. I mean, part of Dale Street is older, but I think if you look at the building dates, they're all pretty much built in the 60s, and then the 3 schools were rehabbed in 2000. So Wheelock was built, I think, in 1969, but it's the same vintage. I mean, it's the same kind of construction, and it's had its own issues. But I think it's unquestionable that during the term of this bond, we're going to have to deal with Wheelock one way or the other. And so a big factor for me on the location was the idea that I don't think it necessarily makes sense to have 3 elementary schools. I think as the cost to build schools and build buildings and gets higher, both because of inflation and frankly because we're required by building codes to build much better buildings now than we did in the 1960s. I think we could replicate what Wheelock is today. It would be illegal, but we could replicate it for a lot less money. But so we're looking at kind of the same kind of decision, 10, 15, 20 years from now on that building, at which point, of course, we'll be 40 years out of the renovation of the high school, the middle school, and Memorial. And so I think one of the factors on the site selection anyway for me was that if you built this building at Wheelock, particularly given the size it's going to have to be in light of the MSBA's enrollment requirements, that obviously if the enrollment met what the MSBA projects, which for those who have listened to me on this topic for a while, I don't think it will, but I could be wrong. If it doesn't, then that can be a 3-grade school. And when it comes time to replace Wheelock, instead of replacing Wheelock, you could simply put an addition on a Memorial. You'd have K-2 on one campus, 3 to 5 on the other. And I think overall it's a much cheaper long-term plan for the town. Now again, is that 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now? Hopefully I'm still here, not here, but hopefully still here on this earth in the town of Medfield. So, I mean, that was a big factor for me, as well as the educational aspect of it. I think I was persuaded by the views of the education folks about the continuity between 2nd to 5th grade, that there's a lot more in the curriculum and a lot more in what actually happens in the schools that makes more sense from an educational standpoint for 2 to 5 to be together and kind of separate K-1. It's sort of a developmental marker there between 1st and 2nd grade that there's a little bit a bigger gulf that kind of makes sense for those grades to go together. Some towns are building 2 to 5. 2 to 5 schools, and I know it was the preference of the school committee to have this be a 3 to 5 school anyway, but they deferred on the cost issue just because of how expensive that would be in light of the enrollment numbers. So those are some, I've spoken on other aspects of this as well, but I think for me, those are bigger issues that, I don't want to say they're unique to me, but they're sort of, it was a big motivating factor for me in thinking about where we go long term and why one site was preferable to the other. And I think the other factor too is that as we went through this process, I think to Pete's point, I don't know that the alternative, if the town were to decide one way or the other, they prefer the Dale Street location, I don't think the automatic alternative is a brand new school there. I think that's, I don't think that it's the same calculus at all to say we're going to build a brand new school there. If we decide not to build the one on Elm Street, I think it might be something else. So I'll stop talking now, but that's my spiel.
Does anybody have questions? So I guess, and forgive me, I am new, so maybe this isn't the right place to ask, but should this move forward in the fall, do you have an idea of other capital improvement projects that maybe get deferred or impacted by the majority of funds and tax impact on just the one school?
I don't think it should. I mean, we have, we established in 2018 a dedicated stabilization fund for building maintenance. The only other building that's sort of an imminent need of resolution is the Parks and Recreation and the FAF Center. I think when the town did its, Pete, when was the original 4-building capital? 2008 or so, kind of laid out the 4 buildings that needed to be done: public safety, DPW, Dale Street, and the FAF Center. And so that's kind of the only other one that would be impacted, which I think one way or the other, it's not a maintenance issue, it's a new building issue or a no building issue or a repurposing issue. So I don't think this would result in any deferral of maintenance. It would remove from our existing, would free up money on our regular capital plan, because in our regular capital plan, there's $11 million, I believe, that's focused on the existing Dale Street building. So if we didn't replace it, we'd have the work we'd have to do on the Dale Street building, and so that could be, reordered towards some of the other stuff on there.
So I think I have a different view, not on maintenance, so that to the extent that we have the fund that's been established for the maintenance of buildings, I would agree. And and Mike's right, if the Dale Street school goes away and a new school replaces it, then the things that are in that plan, on the assumption that the Dale Street school would be maintained, there is a paper windfall that would come there. My issue about affordability is directly tied to the issue of a Parks and Rec building. If we have, and you saw the earlier tax impact of $800 to $950, if we have that kind of a tax impact for the school, in my view, Parks and Rec, the facility for the Parks and Rec department just went out 10 years. So part of why I've got that stake where I have it isn't because we're just going to hold everything down. It's that there is this other debate that's going on. And I can tell you that debate has been going on since I moved to this town 25 years ago when my youngest son wasn't even born. And when I moved here, the Parks and Rec facility was number 5 on the list of priorities in 1995. My son graduated from college, my youngest son graduated from college 2 years ago. There was never any Parks and Rec facility, so that I have no skin in the game around that. But I've had 25 plus years now of having seen that not happen. So if we're serious about wanting to make it happen, we need to have the funds to be able to pay for it to happen. And what I'm basically saying is an $80 million school with what it appears would be the tax impact of that kind of a school on the taxpayers, from my standpoint, has just pushed the Parks and Rec building out another 10 years. Because we can't just say, but we have another thing on the list, so we just have to buy it. I think we have to stop that kind of an attitude if we want to keep the town close to what it was or is.
So one of my questions that I've sort of focused on is the cost side of this whole thing, and I've tried to study as much as I can about site location. I think I understand that pretty well. But on the cost side, Yeah, I think you referred to it as the tent in the Taj Mahal, right? I'm more interested in trying to find out what the MSBA process has a bunch of parameters around. You know, there's sort of two factors. There's the rate they reimburse, which I think is around 43%, and then there's the eligible cost pool, the bucket of costs that are subject to that reimbursement. And so my question is, how comfortable, you're the closest to this, I think, in this room, I guess. So when you look at it, how comfortable are you how far away from that, I guess I'll put it this way, if that cost pool, let's say the total pool's, I'm going to use round numbers, 100 million, and the eligible cost is 70. So there's $30 million of decisions that this group has made, and there's probably good reasons for them. So in other words, that 43% is going to be applied to the 70 million, and we're all in 100% on the 30 million, and that's based on decisions around whatever they are. They're probably, some of them are very valid reasons, like we're going to take care of the Wheelock parking lot, you know, things like that. But have they done that kind of analysis to show you to be comfortable with that?
So they've done it throughout, sort of trying to estimate. I mean, some of it is, I think, and the question is probably better put to one of the people who do at the MSBA all the time. And I think that, I mean, our number, I think, is 39%. So for, given where Medfield is economically, and as I understand it, that you very rarely hit that number because there are caps and there's complicated sub-factors, and we get an additional percentage for doing net zero, and there's kind of a variety of different caps and percentages that are applied. And so I think the working assumption is that the MSBA will cover about, on the current budget, 18 to 19 million, of about 20% or 20 to 25%. It's still applying the 39. And you know, I can't quote you chapter and verse as to exactly where you would go. I think it is true that generally speaking, you don't get the full amount because of the caps in the different areas. And so, I mean, I'm comfortable that we're trying to do the best we can to maximize the amount of reimbursement that we get. Okay. I mean, the MSBA process is set up to solve the problem that the Commonwealth had created for itself under the old system. And so it's designed to push costs to the towns and designed to incentivize the towns to spend more. You know, when we did the 3-school project, and Bob would know better than I think the state paid 60% of that cost?
63%.
63%, right. And
I think it only costs $200 or $300 a square foot versus the $600 plus per square foot now.
And so they paid a lot of 63% over periods of time and got themselves in trouble. And so they changed the way they did it, and they came up with this process, which as far as I can tell is designed to provide enough assistance to the towns to incentivize them to do it, but also it sets the caps in places where they know the towns aren't going to cut back on what they're going to do. In other words, you're not going to drive your class size to 35 to save more money on it, and you know, you could do that, right? I mean, you could say, all right, we're going to put 40 kids in a classroom. That'd be a cheaper building, right? I mean, you could certainly do those kinds of things. I don't think the MSBA sets you have to have at least a certain square footage for a classroom. I don't think they set a class size. Yeah. The school committee has a class size requirement, but I mean, when I think that a couple of years ago we had this blip in enrollment that there were 25 kids in the 3rd grade, and that was bad. So, which was ironically right around the time, you know, we agreed to the enrollment amount. Yeah. You know, no one was saying that enrollment's not going to go up because everyone was horrified that we had 25 kids in a 3rd grade classroom. And so, you know, I had a lot of debates about enrollment projections then. On my position's been consistent throughout, but you know, it's so there's things you can do to kind of make it lower, but I think they're not things that we would do. I think it's probably. You know, I think when we were having the discussion the other night that you'd get into programming, you'd get into stuff that we want to do. And so you might be able to build a building that was a lot cheaper, but I don't know that it's a building that anybody here would have moved to Medfield to send their kids to go to school in, I guess.
Right, okay.
So. That's a long way of saying you should ask somebody else in the details of the enforcement, but I don't think there's any effort not to,
We'll look at it.
maximize.
I just want to get your view on what that, yeah.
I mean, it seems to line up with what happens to other towns and other buildings, and looking at other similar towns and other similar buildings, we seem to be in the, you know, which isn't always the, you know, it isn't always the standard, but it's part of the standard, obviously, because it's what people are gonna look at as far as what they're getting.
Mike, can I share a perspective? And you're closer to this, so you can tell me whether it's right or wrong, but when we talk about the MSBA and we talk about the state and we talk about how the state wants to save money, I look at the pieces of the process I've gotten a glimpse of. So I was asked to be on the visioning committee at the very start. Now, if anyone's familiar with visioning, what you do is that's unconstrained thinking. So, and even coming into it with the fiscal, you know, hard line, I understood at that stage in that discussion for that purpose, it's not constructive to talk about all the constraints that we should be worried about. So you have that, and then you have the MSBA. I think I was the chair of the committee when suddenly you get this letter that says, okay, MSBA, here's the contract you need to sign for the architect, you know, for the architect. And it's like, wait a minute, what do you mean I have to sign it? Well, you know, if you need my signature, shouldn't I get to make a decision? And then I looked at it and it was like, well, I don't know them from anyone else and I don't know why it's this one, but do I want to fall on my sword over this and stop this process before it ever leaves the gate? It's like, no. So you sign it. Well, you get an architect who wants to design a effective and stunning building. They're not coming in with standard designs. They're coming in with what you need against your visioned requirements, and you go through this process. So what I've been looking for in this whole process is a sincere, hard-nosed discussion about what can be afforded. And if it's taken place, I mean, I understand, because I've been as openly obnoxious as probably anyone about the issue of price, and I've done it deliberately starting a year and a half ago, because I've learned in the past that starting 2 months before the town meeting, it's all about the children. So you're not going to have that conversation 2 months before the town meeting. It's either throughout the process or it's too late. But I look at that whole process, and it's a process that starts from what would you like, you know, what would we need, and then we can create that, and here's the concept on the ground, and here's what it costs. And there's never, as far as I can tell, that, you know, like you just said, well, you know, I don't know that there's anything we'd cut out. Well, I refer to that as like if you went to go buy a car and you go into the car dealer, if you use this process, you thought you wanted a Ford Explorer SUV, every one of us is going to drive off with a Cadillac Escalade because of our visioning process and all the things we want. And that's what they cost. And so the piece that I've been looking for greater comfort on is this thing that says, but did we ever actually look at what taxpayers can afford? And did we ever set a design to cost target, regardless of, you know, all this other stuff? Did we set something that's reasonable? Maybe my number's too low, because my design, I'm harder nosed. But did we ever actually ask that question?
Well, I think we did, Gus, but I think the problem is it's not as simple an answer as you want to get. Because the question is, you have to look at, I think you have to look at what is the educational program that people want to have, right? Because that's part of the question. Because if the idea is if you're buying a car because you're driving 10 people someplace, right? And you can say, well, I can only spend $10,000. I guess that means I only can drive 4 people, right? What's the point of that particular analysis?
Or buy a used car that has 10 people. I mean, and I'll hate that I have to do it.
And maybe that's the answer. Maybe the answer is just going to be that we don't need to get a new school. That's a perfectly fine. It's a perfectly fine answer. That we're going to stick with what we have, right? That if people decide that's what we're going to do,
My
that's
used
fine.
car didn't say don't get a car. I said get not the car you want. get
Right,
the car
but I think the idea, from everything I've seen, we cannot build a school that will satisfy the educational program and satisfy the minimum requirements for a $50 million town contribution with the MSBA. Like, I just think that would be a $65 million budget, $67 million. I just don't think it's possible.
So if you think
Now-
about the implication of that, if it cost $80 million for 2 grades in a town that has K through 12, and if you just do a straight extrapolation what that says is that over time, we will need $500 million in capital assets just for education. If 2 grades is no way we could do it for under $80 million. That's, I don't accept that.
Well, I mean, first, you're assuming that it's the same cost for every grade, right? And this is part of my
I think
point.
the high school's more expensive. I didn't count that.
This is part of my point about trying to reduce the number of buildings we have, right? Because if you buy 2 $70 million buildings, is more expensive than one $80 million building. And so if you think you're saving money by saying, aha, we drove it down to 70, oh, we've got to pay now another 70 in 10 years. And look how smart we were 10 years ago to drive that down to 70. Maybe we can drive it down to 70 again. And now we paid 140 instead of 80.
But with that philosophy,
So-
then you should have been advocating for an addition to be put onto the Wheelock School to get down to 1 building.
Gus, one of the,
Maybe I should have been, but what I'm saying is that also was not on the table, right? I mean, what was on the table was a replacement for Dale Street. And if that was one of the options to put an addition, I mean, this is effectively an additional Wheelock, it's an additional building. That's nicer than the one that is there. And so, again, my kids are almost certainly not going to go through this building whatsoever. I've got no personal stake in this, other than I will be a taxpayer to help pay for it. But I think focusing solely on, as you acknowledge, an arbitrary cost figure.
Doesn't mean it's wrong.
I don't think it gets in it, no, but it's also arbitrary, right? And so, but it's perfectly legitimate to say that we can't afford this, is too expensive, and we're better off just with a Band-Aid on what we have. If people want to take that position, that's fine. I think it's wrong to say that there was, conceivably, we could have gotten something 40% cheaper that's also a brand-new school that also does all of the things the building does. And so.
They don't sell Cadillac Escalades at those discounted prices.
Yeah, well, I mean, as long as we have, and so there's just trade-offs, right? There's a trade-off between the educational benefits you get from what's being proposed, right? And there's a trade-off you get on a variety of levels against what's the alternatives are, right? And if it's fine to say, I think that's not a good deal, right? It's fine to say, and again, it's fine to say, I don't think we should spend that amount of money, period, on a school, which is what you're saying, right? There's a maximum amount you should spend on a school, and I think the reality is that you're sort of caught in between, right? To do what you want to do, we'd have to get out of the MSBA program, and then we could build the school to whatever specs we wanted to, and then lose their reimbursement, right? So,
I don't agree that that's true, because
well, I mean, they have certain
had a
requirements.
price
They
that
have
was,
certain requirements.
but there are
that you have
additional
to meet.
features that are here. I mean, I'm
What
not
are
in the
those
de-
additional features you see?
Well, certainly the extra size gymnasium is one that immediately jumps out. I mean, there's
It's like an extra 3, but what I'm saying, Gus, is that you can get a couple of $1 million that way, right? You can't get $15 million that way, or $18 million.
if you look, well, my point.
And again, I'm
my
not saying
point-
your position is wrong.
My
I'm
point,
just saying,
my
trying
real
to say that
point
they were
here,
buying a Cadillac Escalade here is not true.
it actually is. I spent years working in aerospace defense as a consultant. And the attitude, and this goes back, it's still there, but back then it was the mission is the mission because that's where the military, we have to do this. And what happens is, well, this is what has to be accomplished. We'll tell you what the price is because the mission is the mission. What you just said there, when you said, well, I arbitrarily picked a price of affordability, that's correct, I did. What I have not heard is a counter-argument that says, no, we actually think the taxpayers can afford more than what you think, Gus. I have not heard that in any conversations. I didn't hear it with you, and I haven't heard anybody pushing
But again,
back.
you're not talking about anything but taxpayer affordability. The taxpayer amount is $850 to $900. What percentage of Medfield taxpayers do I think can afford $850 to $900 more? I think it's pretty high.
Well,
I think
that's
it's a
where
pretty
we're
high
different.
percentage. I
That's
think
where
if
we
you have an
differ. And
average.
that gets at the root of the issue. Because the people you're thinking of, if that's the town you want, you won't like the town, well, maybe you will like the town you wind up with. It's not a town I would have moved to. The
So
people
good.
I'm thinking of are the ones who can't afford that.
Right, and I look, Gus, and that's fine, and I think about them too, right? And there's plenty of people in that circumstance though who also will benefit from the school. right? And so, I mean, you're talking about somebody who can't afford to live here at $900, but can at $650.
I thought I was gonna get slammed for profligate spending when I put the stake there to start with.
No, I
thought
mean, that's what
people
you're
were gonna-
talking about. And maybe that's and maybe you're right. Maybe that's the people we should think about, and then just not think about the school and the education and the rest of it, and do something different. And it's
No,
fine
it's
to,
not
no,
absolute. Let's not think
I'm
about
not.
it.
No, here's what I'm saying. And I'm saying that if it's just a cost issue, fine. It's just a cost issue.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to spend that much. You think it's too much, that's fine. I mean, then we're just not getting a new school now.
It's not that either. You're saying if we don't spend 80 million, if we spend 60 million, we can't get a new school.
No, what I'm saying is that we'd have to be, I don't think we, I don't think we can do it through the MSBA program. We can get out of the MSBA program, we can come up with a different set of standards and just pay for it ourselves. And come up with whatever we can get for under $50 million.
Well,
Gus,
Right,
I'd like
that's
to-
what you're saying. Like,
when
you
you
know-
say we can't comply with the MSBA standards, but there's also things that are built into the school that exceed what the limits are of the
Right.
MSBA
And
that
again,
doesn't compute.
And I
for
could
it.
be wrong, but I asked this exact question. And the answer I got was you could probably squeeze another $2 or $3 million off the design if you went to the bare minimum.
I think you've been given a very low number for what that is.
I mean, then I think you should sit down with the design and redesign the building. Or just say you're against it, and which is perfectly fine,
So,
to just be against it.
so the stake in the ground is clear on where I am, and depending on where we come out.
Right, well, I mean, I think it's unlikely.
and I've
it's
tried to
unlikely
signal
that-
this
it's unlikely, and
early.
no, I know. And I respect your opinion, and I think your opinion is worthy of respect. And I don't think it's correct, because, again, it is arbitrary. And
So-
it leaves us, and if we do go to the point where, let's say I'm right, or let's say that the people who are looking at this are right, that you can't get within the MSBA requirements and get a building that has a town contribution under $50 million, right? You can then, let's say that's correct. Then the alternative is to decide we're not gonna be in the MSBA process, and we're gonna build this much smaller school that doesn't have to meet it, and that will get whatever school we can get for $50 million. And that's fine. I mean, it's
Well,
perfectly
your-
fine.
Your argument is assuming it can't be done. That's the only thing I'll point
No,
out.
I'm not assuming it can't be done.
You're comfortable that by staying in the MSBA program, building that bigger school, it allows for more flexibility in the event that we either get more students or we're able to reconfigure the schools later on down the road. So that kind of what you're saying?
My view of it is this, that if you look at the numbers, right, if you rejected the MSBA on enrollment
Yeah.
and said you went our own way, what you lost in reimbursement, you'd be paying the same amount for a smaller building.
Right.
Right, so essentially what we're getting by being in the MSBA process is we're getting a 575 student school for a town contribution of 450, right? And, you know, again, I think to Gus's point, I think there's certainly ways to get there. Again, one of the things would require would be increasing the class size, right? That you could have fewer classrooms and you could educate more kids if you increase the class size guidance from, I think it's 21 or 22, is that the school committee target? Yeah, if you increase that to 27, 28, or 30, you could
Well,
make the
that's
building cheaper.
using the design, when you say increase the class size, that would be against a fully enrolled, if you hit the target enrollment.
No, I'm just
This
thinking-
issue is not an issue that would become an issue for a long time.
No, I'm
Depending on growth.
saying is that if you increase the class size target, right? And the building is designed with the school committee's class size target in mind. So I don't think the MSBA tells us what the class size has to be. They say you have to have a school for 575 kids. If you have a town that has a class size in elementary school of 40, well, you need fewer classrooms to get 575 kids than you do in a town with a class size of 21 to 22. And so, and that's what I'm talking about for trade-offs, right? That one of the ways, right, to lower taxes and spend less on the schools is to have more kids in elementary school classrooms and to have fewer programs in the middle school and high school, right? That's what we spend most of that money on, right?
And my point is, but the number that you're using to calculate the class size is against the target number that we will ultimately get to. It's not the size of the classes that we would have for some foreseeable amount of time, because we haven't fully filled up the school with the 575 students.
Well, it's the same either way. I mean, right, it's the class size is whatever your target enrollment is. Let's say we're gonna split the difference and say we project somewhere between the current of 400 and the future of 575. We're going to build a school for 500, which strikes me as just the wrong size, because it's almost always going to be too big or too small. It's never going to be just the right size. But let's say you did that, you'd still have the same question, right? So if you did it at 500, the number of classrooms you need to educate kids, you know, if you have a class size target of 21, is going to be twice as many classrooms as if your number is 40, whether your target is 500 or 400 or 575. So, I mean, if to your point, if the goal was just to say, let's get the most school we can get for 50 million bucks, town contribution, maybe there's a way to do that within the MSBA, maybe there's not. I'm just saying, I always like to assume the worst case scenario for that side. So rather than take the rosiest assumption that we can get everything we want for less, which is the assumption some people like to take, well, we can get everything we want just for a lot less. I'm just assuming we can't get everything we want for less. So if the trade-off is going to be lower cost, lower town contribution, I'm just assuming for purposes of sort of not trying to put the best, you know, not trying to make the rosiest assumption that you can't, right? Because if you could, then that's obviously makes it look better, right? You can get to a $65 million building and a $50 million town contribution. I haven't seen how we get there because of, you know, the size and enrollment requirement the MSBA has required us to accept.
So you asked for perspective. You
Not
have it.
perspective.
Probably enough. You probably have enough to go with for now.
So Gus, you're building to the budget process that you're suggesting that we do instead of building to the requirements of the MSB.
I am building.
Reminds me
yes.
of what happened 20 years ago. The original high school, which is now the middle school, has 8-foot wide corridors. You're not allowed to have 1,000 kids, like Medfield High School has grown to, in a school that has 8-foot wide corridors. So we could not, 20 years ago, we were not permitted to enlarge the existing high school because of the value engineering that had gone on when the school was built to build it to a lower cost, 8-foot wide corridors, and so then it limited what we could do later.
Yeah,
So I think
that's always the case, that when you can't afford everything you want down the road, you won't have as much as you would have had if you just decided to buy it. I'm making an argument that I do not hear any explicit consideration of what taxpayers can afford. Now, Mike's response was, I think most people can afford what we've got in mind. My perspective is exactly opposite of that. I think there's an increasing number of people in this town who cannot afford that.
I'll agree with that.
And that's
But the
driving
problem,
a change in the town, which is of concern to me.
the problem is that the schools cost what they cost. And you can't just arbitrarily take out 10, 15 million from it because you're gonna get a product that's not gonna work.
I disagree. Well, so I don't think there's some universal law that says this is what a school has to cost, because schools don't cost the same amount in all different towns. There's not some sort of a standard thing. Yeah, I mean.
And look, this is the question that I asked the other night, and you should continue to follow up on it, which is, what would it look like to get to that number? And then people can decide, is that good enough? And my suspicion is, I think a majority of people would probably decide that it's not good enough based on what they want for the cost. But maybe they would, and maybe that would be fine, and then we revisit it at some point in the future. I mean, I just think that I don't think there's an easy answer that makes everybody happy, right? And so if we're gonna decide that cost is the main issue, then we may have to be out of the MSBA process. That's all I'm saying. Maybe not. Maybe there's a way you can get in there and get there, but I think some towns that have gotten to the point where you are, they do go their own way for that reason. So they can then say, all right, we're gonna take all this other stuff out of it, and we're not gonna build to those particular
If a year and a half ago you'd ever said that a $65 million school is saying that the cost is the main issue, I would have been.
Yeah, but I think as I mean, this is one of the issues, and I know this is not your case, but I mean, you do have to put the numbers in context, right? So you can say, well, it's gonna be $500 million in capital assets over 100 years. And the question is, compared to what? Compared to the value that you're getting, compared to what it means, frankly, for the reputation of the school system and people's property values, because particularly for
opens up
people
another
who've
oyster
been
that we
here
don't
for,
wanna
well,
go
no, but I think it's like
compared
any
to the
situation, you do
alternative.
have to put the numbers in context. It's a big number, and I do agree with you that as those numbers go up, but to me, the solution is looking down the line, how do you reduce the number of capital assets we have, not how do we skimp on them, right? How do you have 2 cars instead of 3 as opposed to having, what is it, Cadillac Escalades that we worried that we're buying? I don't know what that is, but.
Cadillac
the
Escalades at the
Cadillac.
Taj Mahal.
Cadillac at the Taj Mahal, right.
Just to make I think this has been terrific, actually. It's because it gives a great perspective on differing, and really does capture the issues, because you represent the town, and so you hear it from all the voices. Pete, you and I, we were here 20 years ago, and it didn't pass but it's passed by the skin of its teeth, okay? And the first time it didn't pass, so it's a long story. So I have all the scars on my back from the history of what happened. But for the subsequent 20 years, every town meeting I went to, because I went to them all, thank God we got that school built and got that bond. So
And no one else has gotten
from a
63%
perspective,
reimbursement since then.
I'm sorry?
No one else has gotten 63% state reimbursement since
Oh, right,
then.
because we were at a timeline there that it was December, and January of '65 was going to go away. So I mean, but you know, to the point, a couple of things. One is what we have here is a subcommittee. Okay, it's a subcommittee because I was the committee before, Sharon was the committee before me. All right, and we had a committee of one, which was presented 2 issues in my particular case. One was there's too much to go around for one person, and the second one is you become labeled as one of them. And I think it's really important, to your point, Gus, that we are able to evaluate the process that this committee has gone through for the last 3 years. So I think it's an obligation on the part of the Warrant Committee to do that. Not to support what was done, but to evaluate, to analyze, to audit, and that's what we're going to do. I think I look back on your minutes, on the minutes in September, and your comments about your concern that was expressed, and I think appropriately and was dealt with, was, you know, is there sufficient community participation, and the question on process. So, as I said, there's 4 of us here as a subcommittee. 2 are new, which is great, because we have, you know, clearer eyes from that perspective. But I also wanted to notice that we've already, through Sharon's, from Sharon's leadership, that we've got committees. Every member of the Warrant Committee has some responsibility in going through. One was the MSBA process, another was site selection, another was sewer and water, one was park and rec, one is town planning. So one, and the most significant, financial review, which we're going to start. It's already started, but we'll continue, and traffic issues. So right now, each member, the 9 Warrant Committee members, have on this at least 2 to each one of those issues. Those are the issues that are the broad discussions, and from which we'll follow more. We have, as Sharon mentioned, we have tonight's meeting kicking it off. Tomorrow we have, for our kids, the pack that's supporting the Wheelock selection. Then we have a school committee meeting. We have the school building committee meeting, and we have the Dale at Dale advocate meeting. So, and those are intended to give us the baseline, which you've done a great job presenting right now, and then there'll be more, and which will jump off to these other subgroups. The intention is, and Sharon, you can go through the ultimate respect, is to come together, propose to the Warrant Committee, because you know our responsibility is going to have to be a vote, up or down, and we will have a meeting where we'll compile this information, present it to ourselves, but in a public forum. in which it'll be to be heard, so we won't vote on it at that, so we'll have it a week before, and the timing will be depending on what the article is presented and what the timing of that is. But my thought is that that's our responsibility as a warrant committee to address the issue that you've talked about. And I've been in 2 or 3 public forums where this question has come up. What's this going to cost? One is the final costs are just now being put together, and we're going to review that with the warrant, with Steve and I, and we're going to meet with Christine and Mike. So we've seen numbers, but we're going to go through that. As I've expressed on a number of occasions at these town forums, the warrant committee's responsibility is to look at this number in the total context of who can afford it, both in terms of who our taxpayers are now, what that base is, what the long-term cost of that's going to be, what the alternatives are. If we come down to that, we'll come back with a vote that will say can't afford it. But these processes, and Sharon's been very clear to us and to the warrant committee that this is a fact-based analysis. Mm-hmm. We need to separate as best we can. The emotions will be there, but it can't be part of what we do. So I think we recognize that. Provide the citizens of the town the information which they can make an informed decision. You know, there's no right, wrong. It is what it is. That's what the town votes on. Again, I think it's an opportunity for us to address these questions. Yeah, we have 2 months. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the points that I think is really important, and we're going to look at that, is that the whole process, I hope, that will come through here is that it has been reviewed over the past 3 years. To everyone's satisfaction, perhaps notwithstanding, it has been previewed, it has been presented, but as you well know better than I, the attention span of the average voter is pretty immediate, right? And what our job is, I think, in the next 2 months, is to bring this together in a consolidated information package that will provide the electorate the information to make that decision.
That's a quick question.
While you're passing the microphone to your point, I just had a conversation yesterday with somebody here in town whose views I respect. And we had, the conversation went like this, that the trick when you are in a committee like you're on, or even more than we are, is that on one hand, the most residents in town don't have the time to dig down into all this stuff to get everything that a committee has gone down into. And so there's a very interesting balance that you have to strike between, if you don't tell the public enough, they feel like they're being manipulated. If you tell them too much, their eyes glaze over and they just kind of can't hang with it. And there's this little sweet spot in the middle that basically has people saying, you've told me what it is I need to know in a way that I could understand it, that makes me feel comfortable that I know where we need to go. And it's a real trick to do that.
Well, there is, and I would say that point, that one thing I've learned, if I've learned anything as a member of the Warrant Committee, is, and I know you all share this, is the respect I have for the people who dedicate their time and volunteer their time in their committees. And I think that, you know, we don't always agree with them, but we meet with all of them, and we'll discuss and challenge and the like. But I think in terms of the public presentation, it would be unfair, if that's the right word, I think it's the right word, it'd be unfair to put the school building committee and the people who have put this time into it to have to defend everything. So my objective in part is not to make them defend, make them support and explain in a fact-based way that we can stand up and go, wait a minute, we don't have that stake that they do. And that hopefully there's some fairness that we reflect in that.
I just have one question, maybe for each of you. Just there's been a lot of conversations over the last year or two. What's your view of the biggest misperception out there about this project? And if you don't want to answer now, you can get back to us. But like, what is it that
Joint meeting again on September.
you know? What is it that you're frustrated with that people aren't getting, or that
For me, it's the fact that people think that the Dale Street site is big enough for it. It's clearly the people that know the most about it say the site's too small and we'll get a compromised building. I think there's a lot of misconception about the finances too. I think that's a close second. I mean, I've seen pictures that the Dale people have done where they've cut and pasted the Wheelock project and put it on the Dale Street site. But I mean, I'm relying on the people that are on the committee who build schools who say that if you do that, you're going to get a compromised building. So.
I think for me, this is it's a subtle answer here, Steve. The biggest misperception that I have, I think, or that I see, is people who think that the building committee and the school committee and the schools had an answer and then just purely manipulated a process to get to that answer. And the reason it's subtle is because I'll confess that before this ever came up, before we ever started this project, I sort of assumed that we were going to put the next school down at Wheelock because that's where the land was. Now, I wasn't in any cabal that did that. It's just that when you look at the logic of what the town had done and you looked at the logic, I didn't necessarily assume that the Dale Street School that we have wasn't going to be rebuilt or something, but I can't tell you where I formed the impression that the place for expansion for the schools was at Wheelock, and yet somehow or another, I don't think it was just me thinking it through on my own. I think there was an undercurrent all along that kind of talked about that being a logical place for school. Now, what we're hearing is a rationale that says it's a logical place for a school, but the criticism is, oh, it was in the bag to start with. Nobody really thought about this stuff. And it's like, yeah, I actually think they did. There are other issues that are being raised that say, yeah, this is a harder decision than I was thinking, because I just kind of picked up on some flow of thought. But, you know, I get mad when the members of the public criticize a committee and attribute, they impugn the integrity of a committee because they don't like where the committee came out. And so that I'm particularly tuned into what I think of as a misperception around how the committee got there, because I can even see I had a predisposed notion that that's where it was going, and I had nothing to do with any of the process before it ever started up.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to separate sort of, I don't know how representative the communications I get are, and I think sometimes, you know, people write for effect rather necessarily than persuasion. I do think there are misperceptions on the cost issues. I think there's always a misperception, I think, with any project that you do, that there's sort of a simple solution that's cheaper, that gets you everything that you want, that people just didn't consider the obvious, simple, cheaper answer. And I think to our discussion earlier, there's always going to be a trade-off here, and people are going to come out in a different place and how you weigh those trade-offs. And you know, people have all sorts of different reasons for why they hold a view that they do, and you know, I think in the process try to I think come up with arguments they think are persuasive to other people, which may or may not matter to them. And I think that we've all kind of adopted, and maybe this has always been true throughout human history, but we've sort of all kind of absorbed almost a lawyerly approach or a political consultant approach even to how we communicate. And I think certainly social media encourages it, where you're sort of writing for an audience and trying to come up with an argument that other people are going to be persuaded by, but may or may not be why you're there. You know, I remember this, I can't remember which one it was. It was either one of the housing projects or something else, and someone had come up with a kind of a lengthy argument, and I can't remember what it was about, but it had some esoteric animal species that was going to be affected by this. And, you know, and I just had to say at the end, isn't the real objection here is you don't want this built behind your house? And they said yes. And so sometimes, and so what I have tried to do through this process is at least for myself, to avoid doing that, to kind of tell you, here's what I was really persuaded by, here's what I really think. This is why I think what I think. And so I think that creeps into this a little bit, that everybody's kind of looking for something that's gonna, get the result they want, right? In the sense that I don't want it there for whatever reason. I don't want it there because it's in my neighborhood. I don't want it there because I like this. I don't want it there for, and any of those things are perfectly legitimate, right? There's nothing illegitimate about that at all.
We're
but
all playing pool with sledgehammers.
Well, I think that can kind of obscure some of the issues when there's this effort to try to piece together the arguments that'll persuade enough people to get you the outcome that you want. And I'm going to do my best to avoid that and just try to say, here's why I think what I think, and here's why it is. So I think that some of the misperceptions creep in on that process, where so you can always, you can pick a nit at anything, right? And obviously the proposal that's being put forward by the school building committee is sort of in the spotlight because that's the proposal that's there. And so it's always easy to, to sort of focus on what's right in front of you, and rather than the negatives that might apply to the alternatives. And so it's hard to do. It's hard to say we're going to evaluate this in something of a vacuum, but also evaluate all the alternatives. I think to Gus's point, I think we do have to explain and why the choices were made that we made, and what alternatives were considered, what were possible, which ones weren't possible, why we do what we did, and that's part of it. I guess I think that the sweet spot for the amount of information might be a little wider than you think it is. I do think in a lot of areas that I think what you're all doing is the right thing to do, to try to sort through the various competing claims to come up with a set of facts that we can all agree on, and then I think people can make their judgment about where those facts lead them, what it leads them to conclude about this particular project. So I commend you for doing that. But
So I have a slightly different thought on the amount of information that we should be giving to the residents. I think we should be giving all the information to the residents, not sort of a sweet spot result. I think that in addition to giving them that, I think the school building committee has an incredibly robust website that has all the data on it. In addition to the data, I think that we need to be giving them our opinions as to because we've probably digested more of, I regard one of my roles as trying to digest the information, make a determination, and then give an opinion to the residents.
Yeah.
So.
Just to that point, and I couldn't agree more, that the information is all available now, as you know. The question that comes in is it credible? So we're not going to try and take the information and spin it in any different way. I think what we're really intending to do is take the information that's available and address the salient points, if that's what it is, in the process, and in the arguments pro or con against it, because that's where we have all these different groups, so that at least people can say, yes, this is it, go to page 1126, and you will see what the MSBA requires. And then someone said, well, who are the MSBA? And we'll just say, okay, alternatively, if you don't have an MSBA or something of that nature. But I couldn't agree with you more, Pete. We're not gonna try and spin it down to anything other than to say, yeah, this is where you go, and this is where you can get the information, and from our perspective, it's valid for you to rely on that information.
And Pete, I'd agree with your point. I didn't mean to imply that people don't have access to all the data that they want. I was really picturing when everyone shows up at a town meeting and is being asked to vote on an important issue like this. Ideally, you would like at least the vast majority of people in the room to be informed, however they choose to vote. So the sweet spot is how much time and effort does a committee, like in this case, the building committee, my experience, it was when I first got here and it was the ALS study committee, how much time do you take to explain to those people who have the interest to want, who don't understand it but want to learn? How do you decide what you're going to explain? How far down into the depths do you bring them? But certainly, to your point, Pete, all the data should be there for people to dig as deep as they want.
Not in the interest of making your meeting any longer than it necessarily needs to be. I just wanted to ask more of like a general process question, because I do think that there is some confusion out there already as to what exactly we're going to be voting on at the town meeting. So I thought it would be helpful just to not necessarily have a very, very long discussion about it, but I have heard some people say that they think when they're coming to town meeting that they're going to be choosing between Wheelock and Dale, and I would like to just kind of confirm what you as selectmen who are going to be determining the warrant, what exactly people are going to be voting on, and then I know the answer to that question, but I just wanted to put that out there, and then I would, as a subset to that, if it passes, clearly the school moves forward and things goes on, but then what then is the process if it fails? So I don't know which one of you want to take that.
Well, I mean, I think the article will be an up or down vote on the building as proposed, as is typically the case. I think that's what the warrant article will be. I think as to what happens if it fails, I think to Bob's bit of history before, I think it depends, right? If it fails by 2 votes, then you have an option to revote it. I think if it fails clearly, I think then we're somewhat back to the drawing board, right? I don't think it's as simple as saying, well, we'll go build the new building at Dale, because I think to the cost point, Gus, if the cost is dispositive, I don't think we're gonna get this exact same building for $15 million left by building it someplace else, right? I think you could probably agree with that.
Yeah.
So we're gonna have a series of trade-offs at that point, and I think I think it's a longer discussion than simply redesigning another building in a different location and putting it there, in terms of the trade-off between, all right, from the Band-Aid approach, we decided to do a Band-Aid approach in the building and say, what does it cost to get us another 10, 15 years out of what we have now, and then we revisit at that point. That's one potential alternative. And then you could look at, all right, to your point, if the conclusion is it was just too expensive, what does it look like to get a building that's under whatever the number is that we decide is the affordable amount? And then is it worth it to spend that, right? I mean, because part of it is, let's say you got to a $50 million town contribution, but, if the $50 million bill, for whatever reason, putting us, all the educational program, and I can't speak to the details of the educational program, but that's a judgment for the school committee to make. But if you got to, for 50% of the educational program for 80% of the cost, is that really worth it? As opposed to getting to, again, this is called faux precision. You can't actually measure 50% of an educational program, but so I'm using faux precision. Just like when we get these construction estimates, that's like $58,178,348. Like, oh, tremendous! Accurate, clearly, like precise job that person has done. So it's faux precision, but I think that's part of it too. In other words, with the Band-Aid for 10% of the cost gets you 48% of the educational program. Maybe that's the way to go. So I think it's a longer discussion at that point, based on where everybody lands and what else happens. So I don't think it's as simple as saying, well, then we're just going to immediately pivot. All right, let's just build. The only issue was the site, and so we're going to pivot to the other location, because if it's cost, that's a much broader discussion, and to me, I think in some ways it's an educational policy discussion and what that building looks like, and that's where I'm both out of my official position and that I've got no role there, and out of my depth in terms of it being an educator to say what would the education program look like in a building for that amount of money.
Mike, can I ask a question? I'm going to ask Mike this question to share a perception, and this is more either.
See, Sharon, you are making the meeting longer than it needs to be.
I'm sorry.
But, yeah, that's right. But in that Sharon started this for her in a way, she asked questions. She asked a question she knew the answer to because she wanted the public to hear the answer. I'm asking the same question, but I'm not sure. I think I know the answer to it, but I'm going to let Mike publicly embarrass me by being wrong, and with no hard feelings. Right over the last 6 months, there has been an ongoing clamor for the building committee to revisit the site decision. And my understanding, and what it is the town is between a rock and a hard place in doing that. MSBA funded us to conduct a site feasibility study. The results of that site feasibility study said the Wheelock site was the best study. The argument being made by the Dale at Dale folks, as I picked up on it, is, well, but now's the time that you could revisit the feasibility of the site and redo that and rethink it, and possibly we think you'll get to a different decision, and that would not derail the entire MSBA process. The problem with that is there is no money to do that second repeat feasibility study. So as a practical matter, there's no money to do it now, so you'd have to make a decision that because a significant number of people don't like the Wheelock site, we would throw out or walk away from the analysis that has been done by the building committee, delay this whole process by at least one funding cycle, assuming that the town approves another $600,000, $750,000 a year to redo this. And then you could then come back and look at those two feasibility studies, and you would still have to figure out which one to go with. And so, as I perceive the process, the difficulty, even if that was the right thing to do, is that there's no way to do that because there's no funding to do it and keep on the track that we're on. So it's kind of like you have to play this out. That's my perception.
Well, I'll correct a couple of things. I mean, the building committee did take up the article from the town meeting, and the view of the committee was not to change the location. So it's not the feasibility study that would have to be redone. I think that the request was really to switch and go back to it and essentially conclude that the feasibility study.
So you're saying the committee could have just taken that study and rejiggered all of their analysis?
The study, yes. The additional building design, no. So from the time the site selection was made in November, there's been a bunch more work done on the building at Elm Street. And so that part of it would have to be redone. So it's not the full amount of the process. I mean, all the pros and cons, you could go back to the pros and cons as they were laid out last fall. Those facts are still the facts.
Right,
And you could just say we're gonna weigh those facts differently, either as a pragmatic matter, say, for whatever reason, we still think Wheelock is a better option, but it's never gonna pass, and so we're gonna pick the suboptimal option. You could have done that, and then you would have had to come up with money from someplace to pay for that additional design work. So there would have been an additional amount of work done, but there was the committee did not change its mind, I think is about the site piece of it. But you would have, if the committee had changed its mind, we would have had to figure out, how to pay for that. Really, it's that from the December to the work that was done since December. So you wouldn't be throwing out the work that had been done through the site selection decision. You'd have to, because it's not, you couldn't just, again, take the same building, plop it on the same location. Some of it would have been useful. I mean, it would not have been all wasted. I mean, there's certain systems issues and all the rest of it. But I think you'd have to look back again, for example, for the net zero piece of it. You have to look at the ground study. There's all sorts of stuff that you have to do.
But I think the bottom line from your answer is that if it fails and you need to, the decision is made by the school committee, by the whomever has to decide next to keep it going, there would have to be an article at a future town meeting to allot more money to redo the piece that has to be redone. But we just don't know what that dollar amount is, correct?
Mike, your comment's interesting, because right now the assumption is if it fails over site selection, which doesn't necessarily give us feedback on the acceptability.
I'm not assuming that if it fails over site selection. I mean, I think the debate that has happened is not, I don't think, I mean, it's happening. I think the view that an $80 million building at Dale passes easily, whereas an $80 million building at Dale Wheelock fails, I don't think that's correct. I think there's plenty of people, including you, who would be against the $80 million building at either location, right? And so I think, and the assumption that everybody who would vote yes or prefers the Wheelock site would automatically vote yes, I don't think that's, I think trying to play that out from the public opinion polling without real public opinion polling and people having different views, and my own naive view that people are subject to persuasion one way or the other. I think I don't think we should make it, I think I said this in SBC, we have to make a substantive decision. We can't just try to play it out saying this is easy, that's not, because you're gonna be wrong so often trying to play that game. And so yeah, I mean, you could have, we could have switched sites, the committee is not persuaded by, was not persuaded by the article and all of that. So,
I think that if it's voted down at town meeting, given the fact that the select board has voted unanimously to cite it there, the school building committee voted unanimously to cite it there, the school committee voted unanimously to cite it there. I don't know if the warrant committee weighed in on it. I think that the town might be looking for whole new leadership on those three boards, basically. I'm not sure the school building committee has signed up to go through this process again. If it were voted down, we might lose a lot of town leadership.
Maybe. I think we have to see.
They could be having a lot of fun just sitting in meetings like all of us, and they might want to still do it, because
Yeah, I think we have to see, I think we have to see what the grounds are, what happens, what, you know. There's a lot of uncertainty around it. You know, it's been certainly the strangest period of time, period, and definitely the strangest period of time to consider a project like this.
Right.
And so I think a lot of the assumptions we might make about, based on our experience in the past, that I'm not sure that would necessarily be true, for good or for ill, given the way, unfortunately, things have been and are continuing, sadly. So I think that's just the reality of where we are.
okay. I won't ask you another question that will make it go any longer. We have another joint meeting September 28th, so
Yeah,
until
with
then.
the budget.
That's right.
With the budget, we'll have you, we should have updated policies for them by then, right? Or updated financial policies by then, by September 28th.
September 28th.
We are working towards that date. We're just waiting to get through our Moody's review
Okay.
on the 2nd,
September 2nd.
September 2nd.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
All right,
Thank
Anything
you.
else from?
No, thank you.
We'll keep up the good work.
Okay, all
You
right,
can
thank
see
you.
why Bill comes to all of these meetings,
Because they're fun.
right? I mean,
Managed to stay awake.
yeah.